Good morning, and you are very welcome to today's CBI webinar. Very nice to see you again. This is our second webinar this week, looking at these important questions of diversity, inclusion, representation of Black and minority ethnic people at work. If you were able to join us on Monday, then you'll know that we helped that day launch the CBI's Change the Race Ratio campaign. That's a campaign to effectively get people from ethnic minorities onto every FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 board over the next few years, and to encourage companies to publish their ethnicity pay data. My outside view was that it's always a bit surprising to see that there's still a long way to go on this stuff, but it was a really positive conversation on Monday, and I hope we can pick that up again today. As I said, actually on Monday, we are in Black History Month, but not just Black History Month. We're in Black History Month in the year when George Floyd was killed, and we saw that outpouring of protest and sentiment over the summer, and that hugely strong feeling that this time surely something has got to change. So I think the question for us this morning is, how do we make sure that we capitalize on that sentiment? How do we make sure that we don't look back again at a missed opportunity in a few years' time? The format of the webinar this morning, I should say, is a little different from usual. We are going to, chiefly because we're going to be asking you to help us out with 3 polls that will run through the course of the morning. So I'll ask you to participate in those when the moment comes. And I do want to say thank you right at the top to the CBI's BAME network, instrumental in shaping this conversation, in helping us understand what we should talk about today, and in lining up a really exceptional panel of people to help us get our heads around it. So let me introduce the panel now. We've got Udi Archibald, Professor of Diversity at Bradford University, and a well-known voice on all these issues. We've got Justine Luzerot, who's from the Centre for Synchronous Leadership, which works with companies on leadership and systemic change in these areas. And we have Raj Tulsiani, some of you will know, Chief Exec, founder of Green Park recruitment company, but also, I think, particularly for us, set up a really important non-profit called Race Equality Matters, which a number of you, I think, will have worked with on this call. And last but not least, of course, Carolyn Fairbairn, CBI Director General. And Carolyn, let me come to you first, if I may. Before we tuck into all this important stuff that we've got in front of us today, let's just quickly just look outside and see what else has been going in the last few days. What's caught your eye politically, economically in the last short period?
Well, absolutely, Kerry, and good morning to you. Good morning to everybody on the call, and good morning to our absolutely fantastic panel. And I'm going to be brief because I do think our topic today is just so incredibly important. But gosh, yes, I mean, a huge amount, I think, happening in our world of business and health. So I think we can't but recognise that we are absolutely now in the throes of a second wave of the pandemic and all the implications that has for business communities up and down the country. So we now have Nottingham moving into Tier 3 on Monday, the possibility of further restrictions coming in. And just to say to everybody who's been joining us over these last months, we do continue to push very hard for clarity on what those restrictions mean, and crucially for the financial support to be in lockstep. The second thing I think we're seeing, Kerry, is I think increasingly signs of that jobs crisis that we knew was coming. Some very important research from the Resolution Foundation today about how hard unemployment is hitting young people, and actually how hard it is hitting people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, which I think is very relevant for today. On a brighter note, though, we did see a really important step forward last Thursday, when Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, announced a desperately needed improvement in the job support scheme. And I was there around the table with him over breakfast on the Thursday, was able to put the case from business for more support to protect more jobs. And it is fundamentally transformational. I had many businesses on the phone over the weekend saying they had planned redundancies. They've now been able to stop those redundancies and keep those people on. But I don't think we should be in any doubt whatsoever about the challenges ahead on that. We will be providing support, as always, to any member trying to understand the new job support scheme. Please do have a look on our website. But just to close, I think, Kerry, we are watching the Brexit negotiations very carefully, having just done a round of interviews and surveys with our members. They are actually putting Brexit very high up, not quite as significant as COVID, but it is now absolutely in their sights as being a major issue in terms of jobs. And we are hoping that silence is golden on that front, that the fact it's gone behind closed doors means that we will see a deal. And just very finally, I am very proud that our BAME network, as you said, Kerry, the CBI overall is continuing to focus on this hugely important issue of Black Lives Matter, and that we were able to talk about Change the Race Ratio on Monday, a very important campaign for us. And really looking forward to the conversation this morning with Justine, Udi and Raj about the progress we're making and where we can do more.
Great, that's kicked us off beautifully, Carolyn. So just with a little bit of trepidation, let's try this poll thing, shall we, and see if it works. So as I said, we've got 3 to get through in the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So if we can we have the first question on screen? And the important thing here is that there's those words in the brackets. So this is not a single answer, any that apply. We'll give you a minute to read and answer that quick series of questions. Carolyn, while people are just applying themselves to that, what was your impression in talking to organisations about whether George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest made a real impression on people, and whether there was that sense in the business community of something really having to change this time?
Oh, Carrie, I think absolutely. It was an electric shock in the business community, and I certainly felt it at the CBI, and I know that many business leaders across the country did. I think that we had seen the killing of George Floyd mistakenly as a US issue, and possibly even as a US police issue. And then as I think we talked to Black colleagues, and certainly it was true of my own experience in the CBI, we recognised that this actually was systemic. It was deeply painful for so many of our colleagues, and actually we really had to do something about it. And I think that this language is it can't be a moment, it has to be genuinely a movement. I do think, though, there have been layers of reaction. So there was the immediate I think outpouring of support and allyship for Black colleagues, but I think what's been most interesting is seeing the action that has followed. There are many firms now who have reviewed their diversity and inclusion strategies, and frankly really found them lacking, that they were going through the motions. But whether it is around promotion, whether it's around recruitment, we at the CBI, for example, discovered that we had a much higher turnover rate amongst staff from Black and ethnic minority groups, and we needed to know why that was. I think we're also learning, though, that investors really care about this, and that customers and consumers really care about this. Some research that we've done recently shows that 84% of UK adults expect businesses to act on racial equality. And I think that is something that the businesses are dealing with, I think, now very seriously. But I think there's also, no doubt this is a long journey. Measurement, making it systemic, making sure that we don't let this fade in the crisis that's around us, I think remains very live for many businesses.
Okay, Robin, can we close that poll now? We've given people long enough, and see whether we can bring up the results on the screen, and let's see if that can happen. And because I had the small advantage of being able to see the results as they came through, I guess, Karen, before I turn to the rest of the panel, my quick thought on that is that those numbers are probably in the kind of ascending order that you'd want. That you start, the smallest number is the number of the top 3 anyway, is the number of organisations that responded publicly. But then there are bigger numbers of organisations, companies doing things behind the scenes, discussing it with their staff and looking at the implications, and that's probably what you'd want, isn't it?
I think this. I think this is actually pretty encouraging because we know that many organisations did make a statement, but for some they just felt it wasn't appropriate. They wanted to really get under the skin of it in their own organisations and have those conversations. So to have 70% of companies actually talking about it internally, having those conversations, I think is really encouraging. And then I think what we want to sort of hopefully see over the course of the next few months is that kind of second green bar of the 49% of developing an action plan, that really to rise, and how they use data, how they use sort of metrics about pay gaps. As you know, we're very strongly supporting mandatory reporting of the ethnicity pay gap. We want to see that one go up, but I think this is in line with what we would expect, and it's actually quite promising, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Robin. We will probably all just retire happy now we've done a poll successfully, but let's actually carry on anyway. Justine, let me come to you if I may, because you work with executive teams to build ethical and inclusive approaches to leadership. Just taking our cue from that poll that we've just seen, what are you seeing business leaders do to better understand their role in tackling inequality?
Well, thank you, Sari. I'd say that there are two angles of insight that we have. One is working at the top with C-suite leaders and sort of seeing what's happening, going into their teams. The other is being connected at the grassroots with Black employee networks and employee networks more generally. So those two angles give us two different vantage points, because the leaders who come to us, often that has a self-selecting level of interest in this topic to begin with. So from the grassroots, we're seeing a number of different reactions. We're seeing that some people view their leaders as more performative. Everyone has seen a reaction, but some view it as more performative, some view it as more authentic. Often there's a range within the same company, and so it's the degree to which the organization on an institutional level has decided to go a bit deeper. At the top, we're seeing everyone coming to us is genuinely interested in making a difference. It's sort of like when I moved to this country looking for a dentist, they're not quite sure how. How do I go about understanding what's right, what's actually going to work? The easy thing is to do something that will cause change, and then you can say you did it. And that's actually not going to work in this case because it requires looking in the mirror, it requires going deeper, it requires using words like racism that are really uncomfortable, and being willing to face up to the role that everyone plays in a system, where there is structural racism around. And so it has led people to go way outside their comfort zone. I think that what's special about this moment, because we have to reflect on why now do we see the protests, but also the global interest. And I think why now is partly because the barriers to people looking at Black in particular have been around social norms. They've been around people's own experience. Unlike gender, people don't have these conversations over the holidays. They don't necessarily mix with people who are unlike them. But COVID has taken us outside of our own experience. It's taken us outside of our norms, our comfort zones, and it's made us open, more vulnerable, and able to, imagine circumstances that are different. And that has sort of cracked the insular bubble for many leaders and really allowed people to take an interest to go on a deeper journey. I think some of the standard approaches, such as reverse mentoring, that some leaders have been doing quite effectively, there's greater interest in doing them now. And I'll stop there, but some of the listening sessions, things that we know have worked, people are starting to do more of, but I think there's still more that people can do.
Justine, let me just follow up on one thing you said there, because I thought someone made a really smart point on this webinar on Monday, which was that one of the things that leaders have to do now is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. How important do you think that is in this conversation?
That is essential. We've done a report on, which will come out early next year with the Charter Governance Institute, on governance and belonging. And in the course of that, we did research across the different strands. And so the race strand stands out, and particularly when you look at Black. And part of the reason it stands out is because of the historical roots, which go very, very deep. But part of what stands out about it is, in the case of gender, there's a narrative of competency, of what women are competent, what they're good for, how powerful you imagine them to be. In the case of LGBT, which was another strand we looked at, there's an issue of emotional connection and how much people can actually come out as themselves. In the case of race, there's both happening. And so, and like I said, when people sort of retreat to their personal networks, they're often not mixing with other people where they can have these conversations. Or if they do, there's maybe just one, and is that person empowered to actually bring it up? So it's very uncomfortable. And because of the historical roots, the fear of being racist or the sort of not wanting to get anywhere near that word has shut the conversation down for so long. And so now it really is about stepping into the discomfort and being aware that we're all part of this problem. There's no way that you can, breathe the air around the messages that we get through the media, through every angle, and not, understand that we're all part of it. And so being able to say, I don't know, I might need to do something differently, is very uncomfortable. And I think that that is crucial, but also a huge opportunity for business, given the leadership shift that we need during these times.
Great. Raj, let me bring you in, because as Carolyn has mentioned, as we've seen a range of actions by businesses over this period in response to Black Lives Matter. You sit there looking across executive search and recruitment in the work that you do, but also through your charity. What examples of meaningful action have you seen, and what have you seen perhaps that's slightly missed the mark?
I think I agree with what a lot of Justine has said. If you look at it at a more pragmatic level, based on the 300 odd clients we work with through our consultancy and recruitment businesses, and the 400 firms that signed up to Race Equality Matters pre-launch, what we can see is there's kind of three waves. The first wave is that kind of knee-jerk, slightly tokenistic reaction, and there's been pretty significant backlash against things like, well, let's move to blind CVs. The backlash being, well, why do I need to hide my identity to come and work for you? Quotas, but using the same recruiters, what's going to be different? Their economic model and method of working give a result. We don't want then the last part of that result to be looking for difference on that shortlist. But signing up to charters that don't have a kind of clear pathway or clear outcomes, and that's also something that leads to this kind of thinking where we need to do something right now. And I think the best and clearest example of this first wave of kind of tokenistic reaction is the black screens or blackout Tuesdays, when nothing's actually happened within the organization. So there's that kind of manifestation of what people think is support, but actually it's leading to lower advocacy levels within the organization and with some brands with their customers. The second level of response, I think, is slightly more encouraging. I think people are looking at amplifying their aspirations for the future, and some of that I think is more encouraging. But then you get very quickly into the how's this going to be different for me? How's this going to be different for my colleagues? How's this going to be different for products? And how's it going to be different for efficiency, engagement, and productivity in the organization? So there's quite a hard edge to this, and what we've seen from the 273 interviews or one-to-ones that we did in relation or in reaction to the murder of Floyd George and the Amy Cooper incident was that people just don't know what to do. They've got good aspirations, they've got smart people working on this, but because it's so disconnected from those with lived experience, there isn't that kind of nuance around the change management required to actually deliver on some of these promises. So in the third wave, we are starting to see a bit more pathway orientated outcome investment. So really good examples. One of our partners in Race Equality Matters, the governance forum run by Carl George, has looked at 200 odd pledges made in charters and brought them into the middle and said, well, this seems to be the key stuff. And I'm glad to say much of that is represented in the CBI's charter. Separately, and I think just as powerfully, if you look at what the co-op have done and what Richard Murrells as chief executive has done around making not just a statement about turning the co-op into an anti-racist organization, but some form of material and evidence pathway of how one can do that. I think that's where we're getting to. It's not these promises, but these action plans.
Brilliant. Okay. Raj, I'll come back to you shortly, but let me jump on to the I'm conscious that we've got 3 questions to get through in this poll, and I want to keep things on track. Udi, both Raj and Justine, to an extent, have touched on the risk of actions that seem that are meant for consumption rather than meant to drive meaningful change. What processes do you think businesses can put in place to make sure that the things that they do are not performative but actually more meaningful?
Thank you very much for that, Sari. And thank you, my colleagues, because you've touched on a lot of this. So if we just start by some of the things that I see as performative actions in organizations, and it's just that, people just acting for the camera, organizations just doing a photo shoot of some sort just to show off that they're doing something, that they are woke. And sadly, a lot of oppressed people who have experienced these issues, lived the experience that was portrayed by that open murder of a Black man in Minneapolis. The people who live it every day in the UK, globally, they can see through these performances. And I think it's time for organizations to be asking themselves the question, how do we make it deeper? Because we've been found out, we've been busted. People know we are just doing the first phase and staying at it and pretending that we are doing the right stuff. So some of the things that I would personally encourage organizations to do, first of all, is yes, there is that acknowledgement, but there has to be genuine acknowledgement of the problem. Some institutions are still responding by denying, and I don't think we can carry on behaving like that. I think businesses need to provide that psychological space where we can talk about this. It is something that we need to get into our conversation, just like we're talking about everything else, bottom line and so on. Let's talk about racism. So having that space for dialogue, providing strong leadership where the chief executive is actually leading this from the top and everybody is working alongside that. So do we have that climate that allows us to be inclusive, that leaders are equipped to lead the agenda? The other thing we need to do is, I think it's good to have the evidence. Our work must be driven by evidence. But please, I'm begging all of us, can we stop using data as an excuse? Because we already know there's a problem. We have enough data to show us that. So rather than waiting until you collect the next set of data, you have the next set of business intelligence evidence, please, can you start doing something? Because we know you're oppressing people. And I am genuinely saying, let's stop performing. Let's do it because we're doing it for humanity. The bottom line is a good one in businesses, but I'm sorry, it's got to be deeper than that. And that deeper bit has to go with the morality, the humanity, but above all, is people really living that positive experience.
Okay, Udi, I want to follow up on some of the things you've said there, but while I'm doing that, let's just bring the second polling question up on screen so people can start to look at that while we so this time easier, only one of those to select. So I'll come back to, let me come back to Udi while you're wrestling with that question. I mean, Udi, I think one of the things that flows from what you've just said is that is how much inclusion matters at work, that actually data and a sense of performative action, those things are not necessarily inclusive. To have the kind of conversations that you're talking about, you really need to have a much more inclusive workplace. If you're talking to businesses about how you achieve that, what's your advice to them?
I think the first one is actually work with lived experiences, and Caroline talked about this, so is Justin as well as Raj. And let's work from the people who actually live the actions that you propose and implement in your organizations. So how often do you have listening events? And how humble are you when you are listening? There is something about cultural humility, and I talk about this all the time, where I'm actually saying to people, I'm sorry, I know we're very good at rushing into preferring solutions, but this is time to be humble enough to listen to the other party and co-create solutions. So that inclusivity is about understanding that there are different ways of knowing, and that these different knowledges must perfuse the way we do things in our organizations. So we can only get these different ways of knowing by asking, listening, co-creating solutions rather than imposing, because that's what we've been doing. We're leaders and we know it all, and therefore this is how we do it. What makes you think that that is going to work for all members of your organization? So the big one for me is creating these environment that we can listen, and we listen to hear, listen to work with, rather than listen to critique and undermine.
Right, Udi, thank you so much. Let's bring up the results of the vote. It's pretty stable now. I think everybody's answered who wants to answer. So the scores are in, as they say on Strictly, and they're Carolyn. Let me come back to you. So I wonder if you could give us a quick reflection on those numbers, but then also, because you touched on this before,
Yeah.
the CBI is not just a campaigning organisation, but it's also a business in itself. Perhaps you could just talk us through what the CBI is doing on this front as well.
Absolutely, Kerry. So yes, I mean, interesting results. I mean, good to see that 2/3 have made progress. I think it'd be quite interesting, and I hope that some of those things have made progress in Udi's sort of terms as well as performative. We have a third who haven't. So, I mean, I think that therein lies the challenge, probably for both sets. But you know, good to have that. Good to have that picture. I mean, I was incredibly struck by what Udi just said there about lived experience. And one of the things we have been doing at the CBI is trying to host those difficult conversations and be uncomfortable. And I mean, just one personal experience of mine. We had a session where a number of our colleagues spoke just in very honest terms what it has felt like to be Black in Britain over these last few years. And one story, just I have always felt when I see a police officer a sense of safety, and I heard from a colleague that actually when they see a police officer they think they're going to be suspected, and they don't feel anything like that same sense of safety. And I have to say that elicited, I think, really strong reactions in everyone who heard it. First of all, enormous empathy, but also a degree of shame, actually, that we have an environment where that happens, in a sense that there is racism in all of our organisations. And until we understand what it feels like, another colleague actually said he was forever being called the wrong name because there were only two ethnic minority people in that particular team, and they were confused all of the time. And how wrong that is. So we've been doing a lot of listening, but we have also set. We also have a race at work action plan, which is really focused on how we recruit, how we progress. We do use data. I mean, to Udi's point, but only to see how we're progressing. It isn't an answer in and of itself, and there I agree with her. And then, of course, we are using the CBI as a platform, and since our Change the Race Ratio launch on Monday, we have seen an additional 20 organisations join our action campaign here. So a lot of things on a number of fronts.
Great. Raj, let me just jump back to you for a second, if we can get rid of those results. I'm sure you're aware of the CBI's Change the Race Ratio campaign. One of the things we talked about on Monday was how relatively slow progress had been over the last few years in getting senior people onto boards. We had the Parker Review in 2017 and an update in February this year, and it showed some progress, but not as much as the people who were involved in that review would have wanted. In your experiences, why are businesses not hiring as many ethnic minority people at senior level as Carolyn says they should, and we all think they should?
I think there's three key things here. So I say this from a personal perspective, where out of our 200 board placements, we put 73 ethnic minorities on boards last year. So from our perspective, as the 220 recruitment agency of the year and 219 the only recruitment business on the Fast Track 100, the talent is definitely out there. So that's the first myth that needs to be dispelled. The three things are: the headhunters that are used for this kind of work have been saying no to those clients for those candidates for 20 years. So you've got a historical relationship with power there, where now these candidates are in demand, they're not going to suddenly go to the same brands that have been knocking them back. The second thing is the relationship between the headhunter and the noms committee and the board is often very comfortable. And that's based on a certain economic model, which means that although that cost to the client is fixed, the cost of delivery to the headhunter is very variable. So from an economic perspective, they are always driven to giving what they think the client wants as quickly as possible. And then what we've seen in the last 18 months is that then there's some scrabbling around trying to find someone who looks different. So the process of executive search, because it is result first as opposed to mandate first, in itself has an inherent structural bias. The leadership reports that we've been putting out for six years around the FTSE 100, the leading 5,000 jobs in the public sector and charities, show that as a country, we have been a net exporter of ethnic minority talent at the most senior level. So when you look at the ethnic minorities within the FTSE 100, at board level, about 10% of them are British passport holders. So we've seen people below that level go into smaller, more entrepreneurial private equity businesses or move internationally, whilst we've been importing people for our boards or double seating people, as we did with some success, moving the ratio around board representation for women historically. So what that effectively means is you've got an ecosystem where the chief executive and the noms committee are in an echo chamber, and they're hearing what their supply chain wants them to hear, they're hearing what HR wants them to hear, to some extent they're hearing what their internal diversity and inclusion director, and very few of our British companies have a CDO that reports directly into the board, chief diversity officer. So you've got this situation where people want change, but they're going to the same people to do that. And as we all know, common sense suggests that doing the same thing with the same suppliers, with the same marking of our own homework in terms of what success looks like, means that you only then either get a binary, yes, we've got more ethnic minority on this board, but the pathway to getting that is full of Swiss cheese in terms of brand risk, or we get back to the more comfortable situation for many of the headhunters in this country and directors of resourcing, which is to say the talent isn't out there. When the truth, of course, is the talent is not going to be attracted in the same way now as other candidates have been attracted in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that, Raj, because I think we worry about automated search, algorithm-driven search, and whether that will have a deleterious effect on recruitment. But I think what you're saying at the same time is we have to worry about sort of cozy search that is personal, but tends to replicate, tends to recruit more people like us. Let me do two things at once. Can we put up the final polling question? And while people are looking at that, Justine, can I come back to you, because this is really looking at what can make a difference. And when you look around, I'm sure you think that there are a lot of things that need to happen in parallel for meaningful changes to take place. When you look at things that businesses aren't doing as much as they could, what do you think they should be thinking about or acting on at the moment?
I think that there's a couple of things, and these are obviously things that we're doing with our clients. So there are sort of a few examples that give me hope, but also what I think everyone should be thinking about. I think there's a lot of goodwill right now. So even people who are doing performative action, they're trying to do something because, when you want that leadership from the top, leading from the front, that's what leaders are used to doing, but they're leading from the front to the extent that they know how. And so leading from the front with I don't know the answer is something that people are not used to doing. And that's what's required right now. So there's something about the shift of posture of leadership itself, where you lead from the front by listening, you lead from the front by asking questions. Basically, many of the key aspects of allyship become, a measure of leadership itself. And so I think that the leaders who are going to do better during this period and keep this not a moment but a movement are making that shift. But they're also going deeper in understanding this topic. In the past week, I've had two events, very large events, with the historian David Olusoga. And so it's been really heartening to see that some leaders are interested in understanding the historical roots of this, of this blind spot that society has. and in understanding the historical roots, because there's lots of blind spots, hence the leading with I don't know. But for race in particular, the blind spots were intentionally created. The transatlantic slave trade and all the money that was made from it was intentionally created to create blind spots so we wouldn't see the harm that was being caused. And so when people understand that and really recognize and have that broken down for them, they begin to look at things differently. They begin to be more open to questioning themselves and how they're part of that. So I think people taking an interest in understanding the deeper nature of this issue is also really important. And then I think that leaders who are connecting this to business and who are beginning to imagine what good would look like are also going to be further ahead. What I mean by that is that this isn't just about race. I think this is about how power flows in organizations and in society in general. But race is one of the best litmus tests for if it's flowing correctly. So the challenge right now is keeping the attention on race, not moving on from it, but at the same time questioning every part of the system and the structure. Like Raj said, where are you getting your pipeline from? How are you able to recognize talent? Do you take the time to invest in your people? And particularly people who are different from you, do you take the time to understand what their strengths are? Maybe you have room to grow in understanding how to do that. So I think that there's a larger wake-up call, and the best business leaders are linking this journey to what is business critical at the moment. And the final thing is that they're connecting beyond. So a lot of people are realizing that their personal networks, their professional networks, people who give them a sense of what's happening are not diverse. One of the programs we run called A Step Ahead is specifically designed to give people leadership insight with diverse voices at all levels of the system. That is just one approach, but leaders who are challenging themselves to, within their own organization, plug into the employee networks to understand, not to come to the right answer, but to just to listen and understand, and who are also plugging in beyond their organizations to understand. I think that those are ones that are going to actually make changes that will go deeper because they recognize and are acting on this blind spot and shifting their posture more broadly.
Okay, Justine, thank you. There we are, without even asking for it. I think in a way this is perhaps most interesting and surprising yet. And Udi, if I can, at the risk of putting you on the spot slightly, I wonder whether you take some comfort, cheer from the fact that for ask people what will make the biggest difference, and actually people seem to agree with you. Only 3% of people think that reporting and collecting data is going to be the single thing that makes a big difference. Udi, do you think that's does that seem?
Yeah,
like
that is really comforting to see. And don't get me wrong, I think we need to have data baseline and keep looking at things and how they are changing. But my experience is that people are actually using data as excuses for not doing things. So I'm really pleased with this result. The 41% that said visible diversity at senior levels of business is a wonderful one, because I believe very strongly that if we have strong leadership on this agenda, as Justine has already talked about, if we have leaders that are fronting the agenda, role modeling good practice, and they will get it wrong. And don't get me wrong, people will make mistakes, but that leadership itself gives other people in the institution the hope to come along. It gives people in the oppressed group the hope that people at the top are listening. One of the things, though, that we need to remember, though, is that we need to see leadership at all levels. Now, one of the things I picked from a lot of research evidence is that often we have the very top management, the chief executive, are doing this because they have to. Okay, so maybe the hearts and minds need to be built in there. And then you have some bubbling at the bottom where the grassroots, everybody is saying, let's get on with it. But usually there is a gap in the middle, the missing middle. And I think we need to link that with this visible leadership at all levels, including those line managers, those in the middle who are driving operational activities. also leading in a positive way to sustain this work that we are starting and we are looking at. I think it's embarrassing in 2020 for us to be sounding in this way, but there's always a good time to start. And if we're starting now, we just need to make sure that it is sustained. It must be sustained. And the tangible activities around training is a great one, as long as we're not fooled by the fact that training is a panacea. I think it's the everyday interaction that I believe will sustain this work. Is the everyday listening, is the everyday using examples. So in Bradford, for example, we've been running a program I call Learning Partnership, Cultural Understanding for Leadership and Management, which is about pairing people to learn together. And we've moved away from the notion of reverse mentoring, because I have a very strong belief that we're not reversing this. What we're doing is actually learning together. That mutuality is the emphasis of our program, where senior leaders are learning alongside Black students, learning alongside our BAME students and staff, and just to look at what does it feel like to live Black in our white academic spaces, for example, is a fantastic way to really arm people with the emotions of humanity that is often lacking in our organizations. So that approach is great, but for me, it's about how do we sustain? How do we keep it going? How do we move from this moment to it being a movement, the things that happen all the time? And I will turn up to work being very excited and looking forward to that day, rather than turning up thinking, oh my God, what else am I going to be told today that it's so microaggressively cutting me on, you know, the little cuts that you receive every day. So it's about having those sustained emotional engagement with the organization that makes me comfortable when I turn up at work.
Right, Udi, thank you. We're about to get beaten by the clock again, as we always are on these calls, but just in the little while we've got left, Justin, the other thing that interested me in that poll result was the top result, which was about training for employees on race, allyship and privilege. And I think allyship and privilege, that wasn't a conversation we were really having 5 years ago. How important do you think those aspects of this are?
I think they're tremendously important. I've come to the recent conclusion, because of the leadership work that we do and because of the sort of diversity and race work that we've done for many years, that allyship needs to be a core leadership competency. It needs to be embedded in every part of the leadership journey, and its value needs to be understood, because part of this, and this is why the right thing to do social justice case is great, very important, but the business case must also be understood, because I've had leaders come to our events where a third of the people are Black, and I've had white leaders come and sit next to people who are Black and say, oh, they were wonderful people, but they were a bit junior. The assumptions that people are making about talent need to be questioned. And I think that it goes beyond race, it goes beyond diversity, but we must acknowledge that it's very important in this area in particular. And so I think allyship is important, understanding privilege is important, and they will have ripple effects for business as well as in addressing this important issue.
Right. Udi, Raj, Justine, thank you so much. Karen, do you just want to take us out with some reflections on what you think you've learned over the last year when you've been thinking about this?
Well, I was just actually going to start what I've learned on this brilliant conversation. Actually, I've taken this phrase "leading by listening" as being just incredibly powerful, and I think that applies to many things, but I think it particularly applies to this issue. And being uncomfortable, we have to be more prepared to be more uncomfortable. But secondly, you're urging to keep this going, and I think one of the things I would like to give a guarantee on is that we at the CBI will do everything we can to absolutely keep this alive, to stay in touch with you, to stay very close with our members, to make sure that it is genuinely a movement and not a moment, and that we can look back in 6 months' time and see, to have another poll and see further progress. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for those great insights.
Okay, let me just wrap up by saying thank you once again. You've all been brilliant. There is a CBI SME webinar 10 o'clock tomorrow, so please do join us for that one. And we'll see you again next Monday. Thank you.